Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
The attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise military attack from Japan against the United States on December 7, 1941. The attack happened at the U.S. Naval Base at Pearl Harbor, near Honolulu, Hawaii. It was an attempt to prevent the United States Pacific Fleet from interfering with its planned military actions in Southeast Asia against overseas territories of the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and those of the United States. Over 2,400 Americans were killed and 1,178 others were wounded. All 8 of the U.S. Navy battleships were damaged and 180 U.S. aircrafts were destroyed. This attack would officially lead the United States into World War II. Japan announced declarations of war on the United States and the British Empire the next day, on December 8th. Although the declarations were announced, they were not given until the following day, December 9th. The United States Congress declared war the day after the attacks on December 8th. President Franklin D. Roosevelt proclaimed December 7, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. Because the attack on Pearl Harbor happened without a declaration of war and without warning, it was judged in Tokyo as a war crime. For approximately 4 years prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, tensions were escalating between Japan and the U.S. Japan continued to attack neighboring countries and territories, so the U.S. stopped providing Japan with implements of war, including airplanes, machine tools, aviation gasoline, etc. When the U.S. decided to stop providing Japan with oil, this seemed to be the breaking point leading to the attack on Pearl Harbor. History will remind us that President Roosevelt and the United States had economically sanctioned and crippled the Japanese economy and ability to wage war before the United States entered the conflict. The Japanese responded with an attack on Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. The Japanese celebrate this victory, but this is a specific moment that changes the course of war in the Pacific and eventually causes the surrender of Imperial Japan, bringing an end to World War II. On December 8, 1941, the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. declared war on Japan, and on December 11th, the U.S. was a part of World War II. The U.S.'s declaration of war caused Nazi Germany, an ally of Japan at the time, to declare war on the United States on the same day, December 11th. The attack on Pearl Harbor was the start of the war in the Pacific. Before the attack, there had been no major war or attacks in the area. However, on December 7th, Japan also invaded Thailand, the British colonies of Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, as well as other U.S. military and naval bases in Wake Island, Guam, and the Philippines. The events of the Pacific War included a large portion of the Pacific Ocean, East Asia, and Southeast Asia, with significant engagements occurring as far south as North Australia and as far north as the Aleutian Islands. The U.S. wanted to end the war between themselves and Japan. To do this, they decided to drop 2 atomic bombs over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6 and 9, 1945, the atomic bombings were very deadly, killing between 129,000 and 226,000 people. These bombings, along with the Soviet Union's declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria on August 9, 1945, led to Japan's announcement of their intent to surrender on August 15, 1945. The formal surrender of Japan took place in September 1945 after the war. Japan lost all of its rights to its former possessions in Asia and the Pacific. Its power was limited to the main 4 islands and other minor islands. This all helped to prove my thesis by showing examples of how the attack on Pearl Harbor changed the course of World War II and eventually caused the surrender of Imperial Japan. Although Japan had also invaded other territories on that day of infamy, including Thailand, Singapore, and Hong Kong, it was the attack on the world superpower, the United States, that would change Japan's economic status drastically and cause the surrender of Imperial Japan, bringing an end to World War II. Japan had already been sanctioned before the attack on Pearl Harbor, which had damaged their economic structure. An example being when the United States placed an embargo on scrap metal shipments to Japan and closed the Panama Canal to Japanese shipping. That hit Japan's economy particularly hard because 74.1% of Japan's scrap iron came from the United States in 1938. The atomic bombings from the U.S. on 2 of Japan's major cities in response to the attack on Pearl Harbor were 2 other events that significantly impacted Japan financially. These attacks devastated a total of 7 square miles of territory and killed an estimated 140,000 people in Hiroshima and another 74,000 in Nagasaki. After the atomic bombing, there was nothing else for Japan to do but to surrender, which brought an end to World War II. This helps to prove my thesis by proving evidence on how damaging economic impacts drove Japan to attack Pearl Harbor, and how those disastrous economic impacts were made even worse after the U.S. bombed Japan, ultimately resulting in Japan's surrender. The attack on Pearl Harbor was more than just a push to go to war. It was an event that changed the course of history. The most notable change was the United States' stance on joining World War II. Prior to the attack, the United States policy was to not intervene in the war. They wanted to remain isolated and not get actively involved because they felt that was best for the country. The attack on Pearl Harbor, however, forced the end of isolationism for the U.S. After fighting for 4 years in World War II, the U.S. played a leading role in the formation of the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, taking a major role in the creation of these entities, ensuring the U.S.'s continued presence on the world stage. The United States became a global military and political superpower from its response to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Without the end of American isolationism over 80 years ago, it's very possible that the Nazis would still be in power in Europe. But instead, the U.S. attacked Hitler's troops. They started at their weakest points first and advanced slowly towards the German soil. This plan was known as closing the ring. Additionally, the Soviet Union might take over large parts of the world if the U.S. hadn't entered the war, because the Soviet Union's Red Army was by far the most powerful land army in the world, with 10 to 13 million men. They had already occupied Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, and Eastern Germany. The world would likely be a different place if Japan hadn't decided to attack Pearl Harbor and drew the U.S. into war. This helped to prove my thesis by showing you how the entry of the United States changed World War II and the military actions the U.S. took to thwart the Nazis. The attack on Pearl Harbor was bound to change World War II and make Japan surrender. I have proved it did with many pieces of evidence. I first proved my thesis by showing you how the U.S., in response to the attack on Pearl Harbor, attacked Japan. The U.S. bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was the last major battle between the two before Japan surrendered. I then stated the economic challenges Japan had because of the U.S., which was also a cause of the surrender. I talked about how the attack on Pearl Harbor changed the war and history, proving part of my argument. Japan was originally excited, and in my evidence I have proved that they soon turned away from the excitement once they started losing battles. My project integrates the history fair theme of frontiers and history, people, places, ideas, by addressing the historical conflict between the two countries, America and Japan, and the deadly military attack that was the result. The reasons for Japan attacking America were complex and even involved other countries. America did not approve of Japan's attempts to expand its territory through the force and saw it as a threat. In a response, Japan was angry over the financial sanctions imposed on them, because Japan relied on resources that America provided through trade. At their financial breaking point, Japan decided they had no choice but to attack. The attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the more advanced attacks on the U.S. and an important part of history, but it was not the first American conflict. The idea of attacking other countries to gain power was going on long before December 7, 1941. There have also been countless wars in America, like the Civil War and the American Revolution. For these reasons, writing about the attack on Pearl Harbor aligns with the history fair theme of frontiers and history, people, places, ideas. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, a date that would live in infamy, matters in history for many reasons. One being that it was the main reason for the entry of the United States to World War II, as the U.S. declared war on Japan immediately after. The attacks galvanized the American people, and they pulled together in unity, which helped to create the United States into a world power. The Japanese viewed the attack as a necessary next step to prevent them from running out of vital resources, particularly oil. Japan's economy status was drastically declining from sanctions that America had put on Japan. When the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in response to the attack on Pearl Harbor, that was considered a stepping stone to the nuclear age, a very important period in world history. These U.S. counterattacks on Japan led to the surrender of Imperial Japan. During this time, military and economic expansion created labor shortages in the U.S. To help fill the gap, women, African Americans, and other minorities were encouraged to enter the workforce.